Hello everyone, my name's Dennis Fancett and I'm from the Diocese of Newcastle Generous Giving Team. Let me start by saying thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk to you online and to explore the place generosity and indeed generous giving should play in our lives as Christians. Now, in the reading we heard earlier from St. Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, we find Paul urges the churches in Corinth to excel in the grace of giving. In other words, Paul is pleading with them, when it comes to giving, let's be good at it. Let's make sure that we are all given as much as we are able, if not even just a little bit more. But Paul also makes it clear it's a grace. It's not a command. It's not instructing them or compelling them or telling them exactly how much to give. That's because Paul knows that what we give must come from our hearts. In the next chapter, Paul goes on to say, the Lord loves a cheerful giver. And it's more important actually to get our hearts right, to get our attitudes right, if you like, to get our approach right, than to get the amount right. Giving is a grace. It's something we do voluntarily. It is, or should be, something that absolutely comes from our heart. But what Paul does do is to remind the Corinthians of everything else they're good at when it comes to their faith, their speech, what they are saying about each other, their knowledge, and the way they love each other. They are already very good and an example to other churches. Even with giving, it seems they were good at it once, but the spark seems to have gone out of it. They used to give because they wanted to, because they desired to. And they used to be the first to respond to any request or appeal. But it seems that enthusiasm is no longer there. And perhaps, we don't know, perhaps they're only given out of duty or compulsion and perhaps giving the smallest amount they think they can get away with. And you can hear Paul pleading with them, not instructing them, but he's pleading with them. Hey, that's not how it's supposed to be. Please, Corinthians, you're so good at everything else. Re-find your first love. Get back to the way it used to be. Excel in the grace of giving. Well, it still is a grace. How much you give is still a personal matter between you and God. No one from the church should be telling you how much to give or what you should be giving. It continues to be the case that there should be no compulsion. All we can do is to plead with you, to have a prayerful think about it. And just like the Corinthian church, we know that people in the Church of England communion are good at so many things, volunteering, serving the church in so many practical and prayerful ways, kindness, compassion, lots of other things too that I'm sure most of us do well, including actually generosity, because just over 3 years ago there was the Anglican Giving Survey, and over 2,000 Anglicans who go to church at least once a month were questioned, and the results of the survey included the fact that most Anglicans are overwhelmingly generous people, giving to all sorts of great activities and worthy charities. It's just that many of us don't actually consider giving to our local parish church, or for those of us who do, whilst I know your gift is deeply appreciated, and let me say thank you for it, in some cases we haven't thought to regularly review our gift to ensure that it's kept up with inflation or any increases in our earnings over the years. So just as Paul instructs the Corinthians to finish the good work, in other words, carry on and exceed what they started doing so well, maybe it's time now for each of us to review what we give, remembering that it's a private decision, and noting, of course, that Paul adds, according to your means. But we should, I suggest, be willing to reconsider prayerfully and honestly whether the amount we are giving continues to be realistic and appropriate. Now, you might think this is all very well, but actually We're in the middle of what is proving to be a very long and sustained cost of living crisis. Things are difficult and have been for some time. And you might well think that actually very few of us are in a position to review their giving right at the moment. Actually, Paul's already covered that point at the beginning of the chapter. He's pointed out that the Macedonian Christians were at the time going through a very severe financial crisis, so much so that it seemed that Paul was minded to excuse them, to miss them out in a letter he wrote round to all the churches he was responsible for, asking them to contribute to a special collection he was organising for the church in Jerusalem, who was suffering from a significant famine or food shortage. But the Macedonians nevertheless insisted on making a contribution, holding them up as a shining example. In verses 2 to 5 of chapter 8, Paul writes, "In the midst of the very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify they gave as much as they were able, even beyond their ability, entirely on their own. They urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the Lord's people, and they exceeded our expectations." Now, I like that phrase, "they pleaded with us for the opportunity to give." Can you imagine if one of our senior leaders from our diocese were to email round to all the churches, but then think, wait a minute, I know that this church here is really hard up themselves. I'll miss them out. I won't include them on the distribution list. But would our response then be to say, no, we insist. You must include us. We want to give as well. It would be a privilege for us to play our part and to give our share into this offering. Would that be the response from my church, from your church? I certainly hope so. So let's just think about that and ponder it a bit. The other thing I like is how Paul describes the Macedonians as having this combination of joy, poverty, and generosity. Now, it's tempting to think that poverty and generosity can never go together. Now, that is simply not the case, as the Macedonians have demonstrated. We can still be generous, even if we are facing extremely challenging financial circumstances ourselves. As I said, the trick is for each of us to consider prayerfully how much we could and should give, and then to give that amount, not begrudgingly, but joyfully and with a cheerful heart, grateful to God for the privilege of being able to participate, to make a small sacrifice as part of our worship to God. Now, our reading finished with Paul referring to a saying which the readers of his letters would have been very familiar with. He says, "It is written, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little." Now, that's actually a quote from Exodus chapter 16, the Old Testament account of how God provided for the Jewish people through manna and quail as they were wandering through the desert, having escaped from Egypt. And there are 2 points here. First of all, Paul is reminding them that under God's provision, everyone has enough. It isn't down to how much you can gather. In God's economy, no one gets left out or left with too little or too much. But secondly, the story reminds them of a fantastic incident or period in their history where God has been overwhelmingly faithful to them. It reminds them that they are the people of God. And that is actually quite a good place to finish our talk. We can think back through our own lives and ask ourselves, what brings me here today? Has God been good to me? Has he been generous to me? Because whatever amount we decide to give to God, it must surely be rooted in a very clear and deep understanding that we are giving in response to the fact that God has already been overwhelmingly generous to us. And when we understand that, as I'm sure we do, then we will find it in ourselves to want to give generously back to him and to excel in the grace of giving. Thank you so much for listening to me today. I'm so grateful to have had this opportunity to speak to you. God bless every single one of you. Amen.